And now it's time for Mob Talk Radio with your host, Jeff Canarsie.
All right, so we are going to get into the mob war of the 1990s in Philadelphia. And of course, anytime we do this, one of the things that I like to do is I like to give you a bit of background. Now, I don't want to go crazy with the background just because we would be here 3 months doing this. So what we're going to do today is just a little bit of background, and we're going to set it up for what is about to happen in the 1990s. Now, for those of you that are watching this, I did not include a lot of pictures in this sequence. And the reason why I didn't is because next week, I'm going to put together a little film. And I would rather play that and show you some different things and show you some other photos next week. I just thought I would keep it very simple this week, keep it very simple as far as what's on the screen, not to confuse everybody, because a lot of this is history, and most of you, considering your mob genre aficionados, you already know who these guys are. So we're going to get into it, and like I said, stay with me this week, because once we get to next week, it's going to be gunshots, mayhem, and a bloodbath, okay? So here we go. I'm trying to, there we go. Here we are. All right. So often on this show, we take a stroll down memory lane a bit, and I always try to give you, I didn't realize I talk with my hands as much as I do. Anyway, I always try to give you the cold hard facts, followed by a dissertation of sorts about the life, from a different side of the tracks. And one of the topics that I rarely discuss is the mob wars that took place in South Philadelphia in the 1990s. And I've stayed away from that just out of respect for people I know, people I may not know, and just because it was so political. For months, I've been wanting to discuss this particularly in depth. Maybe not all of the who's who involved, but I wanted to give you a viewpoint from the street level up, so you can understand everything that was in play and the reasons for it. And after some discussions with some people that I know, I've decided to go down that road a little bit today and next week and maybe the week after. And while I could be like every other fucking imbecile, like the Jeff Nadeaus of the fucking world, I'm not going to be that guy. Certain guys I'm just not going to talk about unless somebody's convicted of something. I'm not bringing it up. There is no point, because to me, allegations are not provable. They're allegations. And I'm not throwing shade for the sake of views and clicks. That's not how I operate. Perhaps, and maybe too, I may or may not be close to some of the names you might hear about. And I would never disrespect them like that. And maybe, as my Kujin would tell me, they can say whatever the fuck they want. You know me, I know you. Good luck trying to fucking prove it. It's just that simple to me. And unless you can prove it, you shouldn't even waste your fucking time by saying it. Now, some of this is going to be regurgitation because I'm going to cover Angelo Bruno, Phil Testa, Nicky Scarfo to John Stanfa to Joey Merlino in a medium form. And I don't want to go into the entirety of their lives because each of these men could have their own show in and of itself. And what I want to do is give you the facts and then dive into the street perspective of all of that. Philadelphia gets a hard knock because they're overshadowed historically by New York. So I want you to sit back, grab some snacks, hit a bong, whatever it is you people do, and enjoy this one. Because I want you to leave not just this episode, but this little series saying, wow, look at what a small contingency did to change the projection of the Mafia in Philadelphia. While I'm not going to get into the players as much as some of you may like, I think the focus is doing something, is doing this differently than everybody else could ever do it. That's what I want to do. I'm going to insert my opinion into a lot of it. And opinions are not to be considered facts in most cases. But knowing people how I do, I have a little bit of a different understanding than a lot of other people. And this is probably the closest that I can take you to the head of the line, to the front door, to the last step on the ladder. You feel what I'm saying? So with that, we're going to get into it. So the Philadelphia Mafia has been in existence for 123 years. And when you think of that number and the fact that Philly truly has only had 10 bosses in their history, each boss averages 12 and a half years at the top. Now, granted, not every single guy lasted that long, but it's just doing the math. It's the average. If you take that and then you compare it to New York, Philadelphia has some serious longevity at the top. However, the two bosses with the longest reign are obviously going to be Angelo Bruno at 21, 22 years, and allegedly Joey Merlino, depending on when you believe he took over and if he's still in charge, and that would be 25 years. Comparing that to New York, it's a staggering average. It really is a staggering average, and I don't think any of you have ever thought that before, thought about it like that. And Philadelphia got its start in the same way that a million other organized crime groups got their start. Immigrants flooded the country, and many members of the Black Hand flooded America. And in fact, the Black Hand was established in 1750 in Naples. By the year 1900, they were on the move to America, settling in San Francisco, New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, New Orleans, Scranton, Boston, Detroit, et cetera, in a small town called Hillsville, Pennsylvania. And in fact, it would become their headquarters in Western Pennsylvania itself. But it wasn't their only headquarters because they had other headquarters in other places, but that was the main place. And that's where they trained killers to use a knife, stilettos specifically. And then eventually it would head east to Philadelphia. Salvatore Sabella, who was born in Italy in 1891, would head for American shores after his release from prison in Milan, Italy, at 17 years old. He would arrive in New York and join the D'Aqua crime family, and he would work closely with Giuseppe Traina before being sent south down to Philadelphia to be the first recognized boss of Philadelphia in 1919. His directive was simple. He was to go there and form a mob family. He would recruit John Avena and Angelo Bruno, both who would become bosses in their own right in Philadelphia. At the time, Sabella was establishing his turf, the Lanzetta gang, led by Leo Lanzetta, and his brothers Pius and Ignatius, pretty much had their own turf set up in South Philadelphia. If you've never been to South Philly, it's small. This shit is all going to take place within 12 fucking blocks, 14 blocks. And that's what's fucking insane about this. They control drugs, extortion, and more. They align themselves with Michael Falcone and Louis Del Rossi, who had the market cornered on narcotics operations. The lay of the land, and like I just said, if you've never been to South Philly, it's not big. And I say that so you can understand what I'm about to say and have said and will probably say 100 fucking thousand times the rest of my life. In Philadelphia, it's small. Philadelphia is a small area. And from day one, the group has always tried to control the small areas. But there's always more than one group. They're always vying for power. So you have the Lanzettas, you have Falcone, you have Del Rossi on one side, and on the other you have Sabella, Joe Bruno, the Polish mob boss Mike Cusick, Jewish mob boss Max Hoff. All these groups are vying for turf and power in like a 14-block area. There's not a lot of wiggle room. So as prohibition kicks in, groups are beginning to jockey for position. The Lanzettas want control of everything. They weren't just looking to control illegal booze, but they began to move in on the numbers rackets as well. And as things begin to get tense, a war begins brewing. Sorry, my unprofessional ass with my phone. Yeah. All right. And they just, like I said, they weren't looking to control just illegal booze, but began to move in on the numbers rackets. And as things begin to get tense, people start to get a little pissy. And remember how I always say history repeats itself. Always. And it always will. With a lot of jockeying and turf on the menu, Sabella moves in on Leo Lanzetti and has him killed. Shots would be fired back and forth, but ultimately, because the police suspected that Sabella was behind the shooting and the subsequent 2 more murders, they wanted him investigated. And it turns out that the brother of one of the victims, a guy by the name of Anthony Zangi, drops a dime, calls the cops, and then the police round up Sabella for questioning. They find out he's an illegal alien. You're not even supposed to be here. And even though Sabella was acquitted of that murder charge by 1927, he gets thrown out of the fucking country, and he hands the reins over to John Avena on an interim basis. Sabella wouldn't be back in Philadelphia till after the Castellammarese War. And then he would take control of the Philadelphia Mafia again, but it was very incredibly short-lived. After seeing the Castellammarese War and having made enough money, he retires at like age 40 from the Mafia, moves to Norristown, where he lives peacefully until he dies in 1962. So when John Avena takes over in 1931, he's a juggernaut. Not only did he have a huge numbers racket, but he also moved headfirst in narcotics trafficking. He controlled Passyunk Avenue between Washington and Christian and controlled the local police precinct there, which was on 7th and Carpenter. The location, I think, now is actually a fucking library. So if you're from that area, go look. I think it's a library now. 7th and Carpenter. So Avena was moving the Philadelphia Mafia into a very big family. And the Lanzettas, still pissed off over the death of Leo, get into a car on August 17th of 1936, drove to the corner of Passyunk and Washington, and opened up fire on Avena and one of his Jewish conglomerate guys, Martin Fieldstein. Both were killed on the spot, drive-by shooting. And I cannot tell you enough how small Philadelphia is. You want to talk about ghosts? I bet you South Philly's got some fucking ghosts, my friends. So both get killed on the spot. And anytime that you have groups fighting over small turf, this is what happens. But Philadelphia, from the first boss to the next 70 fucking years, the streets are going to be filled with blood. 1959 to 1980 was the only peaceful time, for the most part, in Philadelphia's existence. And that's fucking crazy to me. And as I said, I don't want to go through all of the bosses because we'd be here all day, but Joe Bruno takes over in 36. He's dead by 46. Joe Ida takes over in 46, gets deported in 58. And that makes way for Antonio Mr. Miggs Polina in 1958. And the situation that's about to go on between Bruno and Polina, we've seen before a million different times and in a million different ways. And as I said, I'm not going to go into everything, but I'm going to highlight certain events, especially this. So when Joe Ida flees the United States on narcotics violations, he basically hands the family over to Polina. Polina, who was a huge earner for the mob, he worried, and I don't want to get into the entirety of this, but he worried that Angelo Bruno was surreptitiously jockeying for a position and wanted him dead. And the problem is, and I want you to see this from the inside out, because even if Polina deserved the nod, even if he deserved to be there, the sheer power that Angelo Bruno derived from Carlo Gambino was insane. And that friendship was enough to worry a lot of people. Polina, and many have said he was greedy and didn't want to play ball, but really he was in a position that he could not win. No matter what he tried to do, he wasn't going to fucking win. But rather than sit back and wait, he wanted to act. The problem is, Bruno's tipped off about Polina's plan, and he runs to New York City and he sees Carlo Gambino. Polina had ordered his underboss, Ignazio Denaro, to clip Bruno. And for whatever the reason, Denaro runs to Bruno and tells him, sort of a Joe Colombo kind of fucking move. And we can't argue that Denaro was going to move up the chain by doing that. He ends up kind of sort of doing it, but I think Denaro recognized the power that Bruno could wield through Carlo Gambino. And maybe he felt that Paulino was setting him up. And it's a situation where you have to back the right fucking horse. Plain and simple. So Bruno more or less sends word to Carlo Gambino about Paulino's move or his desires to move. The commission meets, and because Bruno and Gambino have a long history of making money together, the commission sides with Angelo Bruno. Now, when I say side, I don't think Bruno went to argue who should be the boss. Bruno was very calculated in what he does. He basically explains, look, this guy wants to kill me out of spite, envy, ego, I don't know what the fuck it is, but by our code, he can't do that. And the commission agrees. And in perhaps in an odd judgment, he gives permission to Bruno to kill Paulina. And it's an odd move considering you'd think that the commission would rather have peace than an incident like that because it creates instability. The commission not only sanctions his murder, but also strips him of any power, which I don't know what the basis for that, the argument from that perspective was, other than that he was going to kill Bruno. But it's obvious that Bruno's friendship with Carlo Gambino is going to pay off. And Bruno's basically given permission to hit Paulina. But does he know? He doesn't. Bruno basically takes over as boss. He decides just to absorb power, and he leaves Paulina to just basically wither away. Now, Paulina just accepts that, and in 1977 actually attempts to regain power within the family by asking to be named consigliere when Joe Regnetta dies. But Bruno refuses, naming instead Antonio Caponegro his consigliere, which would turn out to be a huge fucking mistake in judgment. But what's funny is Paulina outlives all of these motherfuckers. He died in 1993 at 100 years old. And he lived off Snyder, which was, I think, like 5 or 6 houses down from Bruno. They were neighbors. That must have been an interesting situation. I wonder how many times Paulina sat on his porch saying, I could kill this prick right now. Take over everything. It is what it is. So with Bruno taking over the ranks, it was a different look for the Philadelphia Mafia. Bruno wasn't a pacifist by any stretch, but he looked at organized crime as a business, one that should flourish because the bottom line is money. Whereas those before him would use murder as a tool of the trade, Bruno was a little bit different. He preferred business to run smooth. So murder was not the equalizer for him. And as a result of leaning more on business than murder and mayhem, Philadelphia would move into the union rackets, and all of the rackets for that matter became insanely wealthy. With power comes friends, and Bruno used those friendships in the government to his advantage to skate indictments and to escape press clippings. As we said, Bruno would move into the traditional rackets, gambling, extortion, union, corruption, loan sharking, but the one thing that Bruno had a tough stance on was narcotics. He just didn't want anybody involved in it. For 20 fucking years, Angelo Bruno ran a crime family successfully. But there were issues, and there were big issues. Bruno had his beliefs, and he didn't want to give up Atlantic City for any reason. Most of the mafia back in New York saw otherwise. They all wanted a cut of the action, but Bruno refused to allow them into the area, at least casino-wise. But he did allow other mob families to get in on the action in Atlantic City for the cut of the proceeds, which included bookmaking, loan sharking, extortion, etc. The move, which one can't dispute, was meant to suffice the mob in New York. He wouldn't budge on them moving into the casinos. But he was not opposed to letting them get into some stuff for a cut of the proceeds. And in return, New York kept Chicago the fuck out of Atlantic City. And that was the trade-off. Chicago got Vegas, and New York could take small pieces of Vegas, but Chicago had to stay the fuck out of Atlantic City. And I think largely New York did that in hopes that Angelo Bruno would change his mind down the road, or that maybe down the road Bruno wouldn't be in charge anymore and somebody else would be willing to let them step in. And I always think much of what we saw from 1980 through the 90s had a lot to do with Atlantic City, albeit some of the jockeying from other crime families. And it was the centerpiece as to why New York wanted control of Philadelphia from day one, because it always led to Atlantic City. As we said, narcotics was not a part of Bruno's world. He saw it as dirty, vulgar, and wouldn't allow his men to get involved. And if you remember earlier, we said that he would not let his guys get involved. And we said that the area and the turf was small. And for everybody to earn, you have to get inventive. And drugs was just the quickest, easiest way, especially meth. And the core issue is two things happen. In 1976, Carlo Gambino dies. With his death, Bruno loses really a lot of the strength and power he had in New York. Gambino backed him in every way, and vice versa. But with Paul Castellano taking over, it was a different regime, a different thought process. Even Russell Buffalino by 1977 had lost a lot of the power that he wielded. And it was just a change in life in general. And it was a change in mobland. Now, Castellano, for his part, didn't like drugs either. He was not opposed, nor was anybody else, of taking profits. But Castellano wanted it far removed from him, which is why he allowed his cousins, a crew based in Cherry Hill, a.k.a. the Cherry Hill Gambinos, to move drugs. And it was a move that facilitated a few things. Number one, Castellano could take all the profits from it without having to be within 10 feet of it. And the problem was that Angelo Bruno had the same sort of belief, but for some reason or another, probably likely money, he allows that move to be made and takes huge kickbacks from that. And it's one thing to say, no, you can't do X, Y, Z, but it's another to say you can't do it and then allow another crime family into your turf to do this. And this is sort of where I want to put you at the street level. Philadelphia is always so big, right? And you have representatives from all 5 crime families in New Jersey. And then you have the DeCavalcante crime family. How much fucking room do you really have without stepping on toes? And the quickest way is narcotics. But you won't allow anybody to do it, but rather you're going to put your hands in the fucking cookie jar and allow everybody else to fucking earn off of it, and then tell your people go fuck themselves. You can make a fortune, you could take a kickback, but everybody else has to fucking starve. Even a traditionalist like Carlo Gambino would have not been so giving. And it's like rolling out the red carpet for another crime family, going inside and then seeing them eat steak, and meanwhile you have nothing to fucking eat. And meanwhile, it's like next door to you. It was bad optics from the inside out. But Bruno probably was making the best decision he could make at the time because he was heavily surveilled and didn't want eyes on him, especially for narcotics. And it sets the stage for some very, very, very unhappy motherfuckers. And with Carlo dead and in the ground, logically, I think many knew that Castellano wasn't going to get involved in a Philadelphia beef because, different than Gambino, Paul was all about money and business and staying out of things that didn't benefit him or his crime family. And getting involved in South Philadelphia politics wasn't going to help. So, Antonio Caponegro, he doesn't like what he sees. Caponegro was a lifelong thug and a gangster. He came up under Riccardo Biondi, and over the years rose to the rank and becomes consigliere for Angelo Bruno. With indictments coming for Angelo Bruno, many on the street level wanted to take back what they saw that they rightfully owned. Caponegro saw the drug trade as open and freewheeling, and there was so much money to be made. Why can't they get involved? And it's very similar to the scene in The Godfather, when Vito Corleone sits down with Virgil Sollozzo. Well, Corleone didn't want to get involved and didn't want a fucking thing to do with narcotics. Tom Hagen makes a great argument because he understands the value. Yeah, it's a dirty business, but if they don't involve themselves, it's going to allow another group to move in, become rich, become powerful, so much so it could overtake them. It was a strong argument. And the difference here is that Caponegro wanted in. And with Bruno in charge, it's just not going to happen. So he takes matters into his own hands. Ego is a powerful thing, but only if you wield it correctly. So once again, this is history repeating itself. Caponegro is smart enough to know a couple of things. Number one, Bruno doesn't have Gambino to lean on. But if he can gain backing from the commission or somebody from the commission to hit Bruno, then it's a successful transfer of power. At the time, Phil Testa was the underboss. Naturally, if Bruno were to die, or if he were to go to prison, the logical successor would have been Caponegro. So Caponegro needs help from a friend, or albeit somebody who could back him in return for, say, I don't know, a piece of Atlantic City maybe? Caponegro reaches out to Frank Funzy Thierry, and at the time, Thierry was the front boss for Benny Squint Lombardo, or the reverse of that. And the reason why I say that is because many say that Thierry was actually the boss and Benny Squint was really the front. I personally believe that Benny Squint was the front. I've always believed that. And I say that because Thierry carried weight. A front boss doesn't carry a ton of weight only because in reality, it's a title. It's a front. The boss is the boss. And Caponegro, especially given their tepid relationship, could have gone right to Lombardo. So why doesn't he? He goes directly to Thierry. And that sort of tells me that Thierry is the one who carried all the weight at that time. Otherwise, why the fuck bother? So Caponegro and Thierry, they go way back. They had always knocked heads from day one. Long ago, Thierry, operating in New Jersey, had a beef with Caponegro, who was moving into North Jersey, and what Thierry considered his turf, specifically numbers and bookmaking and loan sharking. Now, Caponegro wouldn't have it, and a sit-down was called for to dispute their issue. Caponegro wins the sit-down, and Thierry seethed the rest of his fucking life over that. Caponegro reaches out, he explains the idea, and Thierry was all for it. And the reason why Thierry was all for it was he wanted a cut of Atlantic City. And that's exactly what he wanted. Thierry simply placated Caponegro, and it gets back to him that the hit was sanctioned, go for it. And what Thierry is doing here is he's setting up Caponegro. On March 21st of 1980, while sitting in a car with John Stanfa, Bruno is hit from behind with a sawed-off shotgun. Stanfa escapes and goes into hiding immediately. Within a few days of that murder of Bruno, Caponegro gets sent for. Caponegro, believing that everything had been cleared by New York, is confused. He's told to bring Alfred Salerno, his brother-in-law, with him. So when Caponegro goes to the meeting, he sees that Thierry's in attendance. And whatever safeguard that he thought he had in Funzy, he was wrong. The commission explains they never sanctioned that. They never would. They wouldn't even give it a thought. But they wanted to know who the hell gave him permission to do that. He looks at Thierry, who immediately claimed he knew nothing about it and was repulsed by what happened. April 18th of 1980, both Caponegro and Salerno are found dead and naked in the back of a trunk in the Bronx. And anybody else that they thought was involved were tortured and killed. The commission thought that they could render control of the Mafia in Philadelphia. And they would be completely fucking wrong. They would be completely fucking wrong. New York has always thought they could control them, but they can't. All hell is about to break loose for the next 4 years in Philadelphia. And it would claim over 20 lives. Any stability that they hoped for, or any stability they could bring, was out the fucking window. Even with the commission wanting stability in the background, are men who see the instability at the top, men who by design are going to throw caution to the wind and essentially do exactly what Caponegro did. And sadly, for some odd fucking reason, they expect different results, which is going to lead us to a question to ponder over the next week. Why would anyone attempt to do what Antonio Caponegro did and expect to survive that? Unless we have some double dealing going on. And the more I've thought about this, there had to be some sort of double dealing going on. Because nobody's that fucking stupid. Why would you be stupid enough to try the same fucking thing and expect a different fucking outcome? Oh, he did it. He failed. New York killed him. We'll just do it again. They won't kill us this time. Like, that's the definition of insanity. Everybody knows what that is. Doing the same exact thing over and over and expecting a different result. Phil Testa is about to become boss. And it's going to be blood, bullets, and mayhem. And nail bombs. In a short period, we are about to see 4 new bosses, a lot of blood and jockeying by a young group to restore sanity and tradition back into Philadelphia at the cost of more bullets and blood. Whatever Angelo Bruno was able to accomplish, the mob is about to lose in many, many ways in Philadelphia. For Bruno's passivity, men with ego and desire are about to obliterate the idea that the Mafia can do business without mayhem. Mayhem is on the menu, and anybody who gets in the fucking way is going to be killed. And history, again, will repeat itself. Even if the players are different, even if the time period is different. It's almost like the blood never dried on the corner. Even with Bruno's 20-year run, he ends up in a pile of his own blood and brains. And it seems to open the door for the Wild Wild West. So when we come back next week, we're going to usher in a new era in Philadelphia, but with the same results. We'll even talk about New York imposing themselves to the point where it only makes the desires of those coming up more irate. And there is an old saying that you should leave well enough alone. And New York, by proxy, tries to control it. But the levee just breaks, and the shooting begins. There you have it. That is the show for this week. Please come back for next week. Shoot us an email at mobtalkradioshow@gmail.com. Let us know of what you thought of this show. And so the best way to close out this show is our old theme song, and we will see everybody here next week on Mob Talk Radio. And welcome back to Mob Talk Radio. And we are going to talk about the second part of the Philadelphia Mob Wars. And it probably will be three shows. I think that's where we're going to be. So that's where I think we're going to be with it. So last week we talked about the genesis of Philadelphia. And I think you can pretty well see from the beginning, Philadelphia was always sort of, everybody was always sort of pitted against one another from day one. When Angelo Bruno comes along, things get sort of, they steady out a bit. But as we know, there was a lot of malcontent because a lot of guys, wanted to make money in drugs. It also didn't help matters that Bruno was allowing the Gambinos into their turf and territory to make millions, and those proceeds only seemed to line Bruno's pockets. There was also a soft undercurrent of rage that Angelo Bruno was only a captain for a year before he was elevated to boss. And that raised a lot of eyebrows within the rank and file. And it's not to say that Bruno wasn't entitled or that he didn't deserve it. But I think others saw Bruno's pathway being lit by Carlo Gambino and that powerful friendship between Bruno and Gambino. And it doesn't matter who I think was better suited to be a boss, nor does it matter what the rank and file might have thought either. But I want you to focus from the outside in. Put yourself in the shoes of a guy on the street, trying to eke out a living and being told he can't do X, Y, Z. And this order is coming from a guy who, had been boss for a long time. But we got to step back even further than that. Antonio Polina, for example, probably would have been a much better boss, a more violent boss. And Philadelphia, albeit if we look at them historically, violent bosses don't exactly work out down there unless that violence is in short bursts and for an actual reason. Polina had a right to absorb the family. He had been in standing and was a ranking member longer than Bruno. And as I said, step back a little bit and see it for what it is. This is a guy who was only a captain for a year before stepping into the role of being boss. And there were others who had been in the trenches a lot longer than Bruno. So Bruno steps into that role already with problems. And it's funny because, earlier in this show, we mentioned Harry Riccobene and what he had to say about Bruno, which sort of distorts that myth that Harry Riccobene and Angelo Bruno got along well. In fact, it's actually the polar opposite of that in actuality. Politics being an organized crime, in that world, they're a mixed bag. And Philadelphia represents probably the best version of events that shows how politics works, albeit both on a big scale and a small scale. We talked about the hit on Bruno, which sent shockwaves throughout the underworld. We also see how the commission reacts to those events, which will bring up an interesting question that we have to address from a street level. Why on earth would anybody who is in those trenches attempt the same exact duplicitous move and expect the commission or the Mafia in Philly to react any differently? Well, the second time around, the commission wouldn't get necessarily involved. What they did do was back another horse, hoping against hope that someone could rein the Philadelphia mob the fuck in. So after Bruno's death and the dispatching of Caponegro and company, Phil Testa is elevated to boss. Prior to his elevation, the offer was on the table for Nicky Scarfo to assume control. And Nicky, who was loathed by Angelo Bruno for his rash behavior, had essentially been banished to Atlantic City to wither away. Now, I know a lot of people say that's not true, but it is true. Okay. A lot of people like to distort that, but that is the reality. The further that Nicky Scarfo was away from Bruno, the better off Bruno would feel about it. And that went back to two specific problems. Number one, the entire Joe Rugnetta issue. Joe Rugnetta at the time was the consigliere of the Philadelphia Mafia under Bruno. Now, while this may be more gossip than totally factual, I always say where there is smoke, there is fire. And it was in the early 1960s, and I can't give you a definite date here, but suffice to say, Scarfo was asked to marry the daughter of Joe Rugnetta. And what I tend to believe is that marriage really probably wasn't the proposal, but rather a suggestion by Rugnetta to Scarfo. Something like, hey, why don't you get with my daughter? Why don't you two get married? You know, blah, 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 blah. Maybe they were dating. I'm not even sure, but honestly, I don't even know. But Rugnetta was an old school guy. So it's not too far off to believe that maybe he did discuss that with Nicky to some extent. Regardless of whatever transpired, Nicky refused. And that made Rugnetta feel insulted, disrespected, and he wasn't a happy camper about it. And it caused an internal friction within the family. It wouldn't be the last time that a guy did that, because you're going to see next week, what Salvi Testa does. So with Rugnetta pissed, I cannot imagine that Bruno was all too happy with the hostilities. And the other facet was Scarfo was an arrogant prick. And he just kind of did whatever he wanted to do, which made him a mark in a lot of different ways. The final nail in the coffin for Nicky Scarfo was the murder he would commit over a seat at the Oregon Diner, where he used a butter knife to stab a longshoreman to death in 1963. And for that, Scarfo would do 6 months in prison, use the self-defense claim, and it worked. But for Bruno, it was too much. And Scarfo, when he was released from prison, is sent packing to Atlantic City. But while Nicky's in Atlantic City, he makes the best of it. And because there wasn't a lot of representation out there, Nicky absorbed a lot of the bookmaking operations that were there, especially in 1976, as the casinos get legalized and et cetera. That's when Nicky really begins to make his mark. So it's been said that Vinny the Chin Gigante offered the position to Nicky Scarfo, but Scarfo would decline based on Testa being the appropriate man for the job via rank. And what I have always asserted is that Nicky Scarfo damn well knew the temperature on the streets, and he knew the bloodletting wasn't over. And rather than put himself into a position where he might not survive, he just accepted it and went along with Testa getting the promotion and him becoming Testa's consigliere. For Gigante, I think the reasoning there specifically was that Scarfo probably was more willing to bend at the knees over Atlantic City than anybody else. And with Nicky more resembling a New York gangster rather than a Philadelphia one in character and terse, it makes more sense as to why Gigante would gently nudge Scarfo in that direction. But as we know, Scarfo sits back and lets Testa take over. So Phil Testa, he's not going to last very long. He adds Peter Casella as his underboss, and Nicky Scarfo was consigliere. And a lot of it was unresolved business on the streets. And Testa serving Angelo Bruno for as long as he did was viewed sort of Bruno 2.0. A guy who didn't have the acumen to run the streets or the backbone for it. Philadelphia was unsettled, and too many guys wanted to be front and center, and too many guys wanted money, and Testa was viewed as soft, another version of Bruno, and the food chain that supplied the Philadelphia Mafia wasn't going to endure another Bruno, and times needed to change. In February of 1981, Operation Gangplank would drop, and it would be the first time that the RICO Act is used to go after gangsters. 9 defendants, 13 co-conspirators would be arrested. Nicky Scarfo, Salvatore Merlino, Phil Testa, Joe Cingolini, Pat Spirito, Mario and Harry Riccobene, Frank Narducci, and a bunch of others would be indicted. And the charges ranged from loan sharking to extortion to bookmaking and narcotics. Those charges were based on investigations between April 20th of 76 and February 15th of 1978. And I want you to pay attention to that, because the shit we're about to tell you is going to blow the roof off of everything you've ever heard or known. These charges were based on investigations that went from April 20th of 1976 to February 15th of 1978. Over 2 years of investigations, okay? Now, Remember when I told you that on this show previously that I always felt that Nicky Scarfo knew that Bruno was going to get killed? And that was just kind of a theory that I had. It was a gut feeling I had. I didn't have anything at the time that could point me in the direction to say, yeah, you're absolutely right. But every once in a while, boy, does Jeff Canarsie right on the mark with shit. And this is why I say to you, the Jeff Nadeaus of the world, the Lee Coles of the world, have no acumen, no street politics, nothing. They don't understand it. This is not me guessing and getting it right. This is me using street acumen, knowing what I know about people, understanding how the streets operates. And then I find out I'm right, and I'm kind of like, go figure. So my theory was that Nicky Scarfo knew Bruno was going to get killed. And today I'm here to tell you that I was 100% correct. Buried in court documents that I've had, that I didn't go through, there is a hidden gem. There was a meeting that the FBI wiretapped and surveilled. The meeting, it was actually two meetings, believe it or not. The first meeting took place on April 20th of 1976. And there was another meeting on November 4th of 1977. 3 years before Bruno gets clipped, okay? At this meeting was Nicky Scarfo and many others involved in the indictment. And the discussion was about who is going to take over leadership and control the Philadelphia Mafia. This is in 76 and 77. So they're already posturing. And what they're discussing is an overthrow of sorts, albeit to some extent. And I also, at the same time, long suspected that John Stanfa, who was Bruno's driver, was involved too. And the mere fact that he was unscathed in that entire situation told me that he had to have helped set up Bruno. Because when Philadelphia shoots, they kill anybody. They're not everybody. They're not going to leave a witness. Caponegro for sure would have clipped Stanfa to remove a witness if he wasn't aware of the situation. But already in the background, everyone else seems to be scheming. And furthering that, why would Scarfo and others be debating hierarchical changes if they didn't know something was coming? And quick. A month after the indictment, March 15th, 1981, Phil Testa pulls up in front of his row house on Porter Street. As he shuts his car door, walks up to the stoop and opens the door, a huge explosion ensues, blowing the house to shreds and almost leveling everything around it. Testa would be blown some 25 feet off his stoop into the street. Testa was unconscious but alive, but doctors did all they could. Phil Testa was dead. The plot to kill Testa, the feds allege, went back to his underboss Peter Casella and alleged Captain Frank Narducci. Now, this is where I need to step in for a second and make it a little more palatable and understandable. Number one, and I just said this, but it bears repeating again. Content creators and authors get this wrong. They believe for some odd reason that the murder of Testa sparked a mob war. And I've even seen creators and other people claim that the New York mob killed both Bruno and Testa. And it's all bullshit. This was an internal beef. New York did step in and handle the murders of Bruno with extreme prejudice. That we do know. They allowed Testa to take over and hoped for the best. But indictments and beliefs that Testa was just another Bruno was enough for everybody to plot and scheme. Nobody wanted another Bruno, and that's exactly why Phil Testa got killed. There was no mob war after that. Actually, believe it or not, they call it a mob war, but actually it's Salvi Testa, Phil's son, who goes absolutely batshit crazy and starts killing anybody he thought was involved. I mean, everyone, that's not a mob war. That is vengeance and vendetta bullshit. But more on that in a minute. Once again, Scarfo, as we said, had to have known. I've speculated that for years. I suspected that he knew the temperature on the streets. But now that we know that he in fact took part in meetings before Bruno's hit, and we even addressed the Stanfa thing. However, you mean to tell me that Nicky Scarfo knew nothing about Testa or Casella's desires? Nicky was the consigliere, and with and with tentacles back into New York, there is 0% chance that Casella does this without the backing of Nicky Scarfo, who can avail of himself playing the I had no idea bullshit card. knowing Casella likely would be murdered for what he did. And this was Scarfo playing a hand we've seen so many times throughout mob history. Now, what you may ask, and rightfully so, if Scarfo wanted it, why didn't he just accept the position when Chin nudged him? And the answer to that is optics. He knew guys were pissed. He knew the violence was going to continue to some form or fashion. He probably knew what Casella's desires were. And Narducci probably only goes along with it because Casella says, I'm going to name you underboss. So there's initiative for Narducci to get involved. And I think that Scarfo knew in order to gain the support of those around him, he had to be on board with certain things to get the support down the line. I also think he knew what was coming and wanted no part of it. Because had Scarfo absorbed prior to Testa, there could have been some internal beefs, and Scarfo, I'm sure, realized that he would likely have to kill Casella and others to maintain order. So the move makes sense on many political levels. Once Scarfo gets through the bug lighting at Testa, Casella's removal, and the revenge of the Narducci hit, then he has nobody who can challenge him. Nobody. And out of all of those guys there, other than Bruno, Nicky's the only one that had tentacles back in New York. It's a move by proxy. After Testa's death, Nicky assumes control with the backing of the Genovese crime family through Bobby Manna and Chin Gigante. Scarfo would actually spend time with Bobby Manna in prison, and the two had grown close, which only amplifies his abilities and his power through friendships. As Scarfo takes over, he names Salvatore Merlino his underboss, and to placate everyone else, he names Frank Monti, his consigliere who had been a Testa loyalist. So, Nicky being boss, at least from an outside perspective at first, it was a good move. Not only would Nicky not tolerate the same types of backbiting from his underlings, but Nicky also wanted to hone in on construction and union corruption and push it further into the abyss than Bruno ever could. But that would never be the case because as quick as Nicky Scarfo tried, Nicky Scarfo had problems. He was more temper than intelligence. Scarfo did, however, push into Atlantic City, especially in the construction and cement market, which was a pretty smart move for the little penknife, I got to be honest. Nicky's first year was marred in mayhem. Salvi Testa, the son of Phil Testa, had been made in an induction ceremony in 1980, oversaw by his father Phil Testa and Peter Casella. Within a year, his father would be killed. Nicky pulled Salvi close to him and handed him a lot of his father's bookmaking and loan sharking operations, and Salvi was able to take those and make them even more profitable. And that shows Nicky Scarfo that this kid can fucking earn. And if the New York Mafia was irate over the murder at Testa, they certainly didn't show it. And I expect that they expected at least some form of retaliation would happen. And this is where things begin to get interesting. January 7th of 1982, Frank Chicky Narducci, 49, was shot and killed outside of his home in South Philadelphia by Salvi Testa, who got permission from Nicky Scarfo to kill him. Why would Nicky allow that, especially when Narducci had been a huge earner for the family, and he knew something was coming down the line for Testa anyway. It's optics and politics all in one shot. Number one, Nicky knows New York is watching. He also knows that Testa is irate and wants revenge, which in the streets is his right to do. And Nicky is trying to avoid an all-out war. If he tells Salvi Testa, you can't, all hell's going to break loose. So you know what? Let's release that pressure valve and let him get retribution, and that'll end that. And he's earning a fuckload of money, so let's appease to him. Nicky's a smart guy. He knows what he's doing in this instant. And as well, this is a brand new regime. And Nicky Scarfo is not going to accept people killing bosses without expressed consent. Now, this is the only reason why Scarfo allows this. And the next question you're going to ask me is, like we said earlier, why on earth would Frank Narducci get into a situation like this when he saw what happened to previous guys like Caponegro and everybody else? And it's really simple. It's a simple answer. He knew Nicky was okay with it. Nicky was a part of it. He was in agreement with it, but he turned his head. A fucking snake in the grass. Otherwise, I don't think Frank goes along with any of it. Frank was an old school, non-greedy, shrewd, deadly gangster. He had been in the mob for decades and never tried to buck up the system. So why now, all of a sudden? If Scarfo took meetings with Testa and others about Bruno, it's really not hard to imagine Nicky doing the same fucking thing behind Testa's back. So it's always been my belief that Frank wasn't worried because everybody was on board. Otherwise, you think Frank's going to just put himself out in public? No. Common sense here, folks. So what about Casella? Well, Casella takes off to Florida after the murder of Testa. And then what he does is he tries to anoint himself boss from Florida. Casella tells everybody that he had permission to hit Testa and that New York knew about it. And it was a bull-faced lie. Everybody knew it. At least that's what Nicky Scarfo tries to tell everybody, because according to Nicky Scarfo, he went to New York to find out what happened. Did they sanction it? And was told the opposite. If you believe for 1 second that that ever took place, then I'm going to tell you could eat rocks and they taste like popcorn. It's bullshit. It's bullshit. For his actions, Casella is actually thrown out of the Mafia. Do I believe that? Yeah, I believe he was thrown out of the Mafia, 100%. Do I believe that Casella lied about permission? No, I think he took off because he knew he was in deep shit. Because he realizes, because just think of it, Nicky Scarfo's in with him, then all of a sudden this happens and he starts to hear whispers of Scarfo has no clue what's going on. Now he's not, same situation between Funzi Thierry and Antonio Caponegro. Same sort of shit, just different time period. He realizes Scarfo's going to fucking lie and say, oh, I knew nothing about this, which means Casella's going to be killed. So rather than sit around and wait to figure that out or to even argue, he takes off to Florida. That's the bottom line. Nicky Scarfo pulls a Funzi Thierry. April 15th, 1981, a year after the death of Phil Testa, Salvi Testa strikes again. Rocco Marinucci, 30, who at the time owned Pop's Pizza in South Philadelphia, was found dead in a pile of debris left in a parking lot south of 8th and Tasker. Marinucci had been a driver for Casella, and he was the man responsible for the bomb which killed Phil Testa. Marinucci's body had been beaten badly and shot several times. 3 M90s were placed in his mouth, and it was a sign from Salvi Testa. You made the bomb, now you're fucking dead. Testa was allowed his revenge. If New York had hoped that Nicky could quell whatever little violence was left over, they were dead wrong. One of the reasons why New York backed Nicky to begin with was basic. They all wanted a piece of Atlantic City, and Bruno was completely in the opposite belief. Other mob families could move drugs on their turf for a kickback, and they could operate out of Atlantic City and North Jersey and whatever. But the poaching at the casinos was a non-starter. However, Scarfo was a little different in that regard. Now, while I can't verify that he allowed New York to move in, most of the New York mob suspected that they could. And I think that's largely why Nicky Scarfo got backed. He was someone who wanted to be noted, somebody who wanted to be feared, and with that comes certain concessions. Nicky moves the family into narcotics almost immediately, which shows that he was differential in terms of his beliefs compared to Bruno's. It was about money to him and not much else, and the only way you control guys in the streets is through shakedowns and murder. One of the differences between Bruno and Scarfo is Bruno allowed certain other criminal groups to function in their turf. Scarfo was completely opposite of that. Anybody who wanted to conduct business in their area had to pay a tax or else. Harry Riccobene, who had his own crew of earners, typically didn't kick back a ton of money to Angelo Bruno, but he did. But under Scarfo, it was pay the fuck up or get your head and your hands chopped off. And more on Riccobene later. But Scarfo's way of handling disputes was murder. He didn't have time or the mentality for negotiations. It was his way or off with your head. And the reason why I'm showcasing Scarfo this way is to explain on a street level how things function. Murder has and always will be the equalizer in every facet of organized crime. The problem is when you have someone like Nicky who doesn't have any patience, would rather rule by violence and mayhem, it has a tendency to send a message on the streets that there is no bargaining. It's his show, it's his circus, and you either get on the train knowing the rules or you get off and hope he can't bind you. And while we can certainly all understand how a new boss wants to show power by flexing and giving the tense feelings and the uncertainty in South Philadelphia at the time, we can all understand why Nicky was and how and the reasons for why he was doing what he was doing, at least initially. And I think initially he has to set the stage. He has to set the tone. But at the same time, there's a limit to the overkill. So I want to put you in a situation. You're used to Bruno as the boss, relatively peaceful guy for the most part. And with Bruno, you can sit down, you can explain. He's a level-headed guy, and he's going to listen because greasing the machine is much better than putting water on it. With Testa, it was Bruno 2.0, but with some differences, and the streets wanted something different. With Nicky coming in, he has to set the standard by which everyone will be judged. However, when you are underneath all of that, it creates instability, which creates an atmosphere of fear, meaning that if you make one simple fucking mistake, he's going to kill you. There is no bargaining. There is no understanding. There are no explanations. And that creates turmoil, and it also creates informants. Bottom line. And I'm not lending an excuse for people to inform. At all, not at all. But you can understand that, well, your options are to kill him, to run, or to turn. And that's what happened with Nicky DeCrow, Caramondi, and Tommy Del Giorno. They went rat. And I'm going to get to them next week. So as Nicky takes over and everybody's getting taxed, Nicky, Nicky does need the backing of New York, or more so, he will seek it out. At first, it was Vinny Gigante, and I still say I think what New York wanted was North Jersey and inroads to Atlantic City. And I think what drew New York to wanting to control Philadelphia in general, because they've always tried to control Philly. It's Gigante who wanted to greenlight Scarfo all along. But as we know, Scarfo deferred, and we've talked about why. And once Scarfo begins to show signs that his bloodletting is going to get out of control, Vinny the Chin says, fuck this noise. And how deep that connection was probably came through Bobby Manna in all reality. And once shots begin getting fired in South Philly, it would make more sense for the Genovese to back off and stay away from that. And in the interim, John Gotti steps in. And Gotti, I think, saw Atlantic City inroads for himself as well. And that's truly the only reason why Gotti would even have gotten involved with Nicky Scarfo. Scarfo was smitten with John Gotti and all of New York. And there was a noted sit-down between Nicky Scarfo and John Gotti over an issue that had to do with Phil Narducci. There was some sort of beef between a member of the Gambinos and Phil, who I believe, according to the FBI, was a made man at the time. And what ended up happening was there was a dispute. Guys were angry. Somebody's going to get killed. Temperature, rage, anger. So Gotti ends up coming and meeting with Scarfo and Phil Narducci, the other guy involved. And Gotti settles the beef, siding against his own guy, saving Narducci's life, more than likely, and explained to Nicky Scarfo what that meaning. If any of my men ever step out of line again with you in your turf, you kill them. You don't even have to let me know. And imagine what that does to Nicky Scarfo's ego right then and there. The guy he's preening in front of, the guy he wants to strut in front of, the guy he really wants to fucking be in every facet of his life is siding with him. Rather than it just being a justification of the rules and the street codes, Nicky looks at it as, I'm powerful. I'm the powerful fuck. John Gotti just gave me power. That's the way Nicky sees shit. And it essentially is stroking Scarfo for all he's worth. And that made Scarfo even more fucking dangerous than he ever was. And we're going to stop here because I want to get into the full details of what happens between Harry Riccobene and Nicky Scarfo. And it really starts to spark a bloodshed. It is the beginning of the end for Scarfo, but he still has some gas in the tank. We're going to get into Nicky Scarfo moving into Atlantic City, forming his own construction cement company, and then pulling the plug on Salvi Testa. And we're going to get into the details as to why Scarfo had him killed and how the streets would react, because that has a huge domino effect. When you kill a guy for no fucking reason that is well-liked by everybody, that creates a domino effect. And it's also going to be Nicky's downfall. and the ushering in of a new name that we spoke about earlier, John Stanfa, who deserved nothing, who just arrived, who didn't earn it. And we're also going to discuss a young, different generation of mafioso that is about to show up, take over, and it's going to be more murder and mayhem. So please come back next week for part 3 of the Philadelphia Mob Wars. So there you have it. That's all we're going to do for this week. I promise next week we will have the visual podcast out. In the meantime, please join us tomorrow night at 8:30 on YouTube. We will talk about something adventurous. I have no idea what I'm going to talk about yet, but hopefully between now and then, we'll come up with something. Have a great weekend. It's nice out. Go out and do something fun. We'll see everybody next week on Mob Talk Radio, and hopefully see all of you tomorrow night. I'll probably repeat this again. And the disclaimer is going to be that I'm not going to talk about murder for murder, hit for hit. It's sort of a street perspective. And also because this portion of the show deals with people I may or may not know. Out of respect to them, I'm not going to mention their names. So if you want to look up all this stuff for yourself, you can. It's just, even though it's history, there's just certain limitations to what I will do. Okay, so last week we discussed everything that was going on in South Philadelphia. And by the way, this isn't going to be a huge ending, and I apologize for that. But and Nicky Scarfo had really created a fucking mess with his bloodletting and going after Harry Riccobene, which really only ended up blowing up in his face, right? He would create a massive instability within the ranks of Cosa Nostra because of his murder first, worry later type of thinking. It would cause his own men to go bad, becoming rats. It doesn't make what those rats did acceptable on any level. But I think on a visceral level, we can kind of all sort of understand how everybody was feeling, right? So between 1987 and 89, Nicky Scarfo gets hammered 3 times for conspiracy, racketeering, and murder. He's sentenced to 3 consecutive 14-year terms, 55 years, and life. His life sentence was overturned. However, Filianetti pretty much puts the exclamation point on that when he goes bad in 1989. Scarfo would be off to Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, where he would try to no avail to control the Philly Mafia. So how does Stanfa arrive? Well, simply stated, Stanfa really had mob roots and connections. Stanfa had immigrated to the United States in 1964 at age 23 from Sicily, and he would settle down in New York, according to what we know from the FBI. Stanfa had mob ties to the Gambino crime family through his brothers and his brother-in-law, who, it has been said, were made in Italy, but then became made men within the Gambino crime family as well. Now, what exactly Stanfa got involved in those early New York days really isn't known. Although the FBI had surveillance photos of him and had followed him in the early days, they chalked him up to being nobody, just somebody that was just hanging around. But what we do know is that at some point, Stanfa is sent to Philadelphia by Carlo Gambino to be Angelo Bruno's driver. Now, I cannot say certifiably that Carlo did that, but it's been said that Stanfa was sent there as a favor to Bruno. To my knowledge, Stanfa was not a made guy within those years, and if anything, he was just an associated member of the mob. So, on March 21st of 1980, when Bruno gets clipped, as we know, John Stanfa was his driver. Bruno was shot from behind with a shotgun, and over the years, it's been alleged that Stanfa 100% knew and was in on that hit. And I say that for this reason. While I cannot give you a smoking gun, I cannot give you a photo, I think the fact that Stanfa was not killed that night says a lot. Because Philadelphia guys aren't going to leave a witness. And other reports were that Stanfa went back to Philly in the 1960s. So I can't even confirm that either. So there's a lot of Stanfa. There's a lot with Stanfa that has a lot of question marks. But with Stanfa, there's not a lot of concrete evidence about anything. I just got to be honest with you. But in any event, that night Bruno's murdered, Stanfa's pretty much unharmed. And I don't think Antonio Caponegro would have left a confidant and a friend of Bruno's alive. Unless, of course, Stanfa made sure that Bruno was left out in the open. So the streets were rife with double talking and anger, and Bruno and Stanfa, not to have known in some capacity that there was talk going on, I have a hard time believing that, especially Stanfa not hearing whispers. I don't think any boss in all reality inexplicably all of a sudden forgets what they do for a living and that they're here today, gone tomorrow. It's not a foregone conclusion to these guys. So for Bruno to be left that wide open just doesn't pass the smell test to me. It never has. So after the murder of Bruno, Stanfa, because he is a witness and a lone survivor, naturally the cops and investigators are going to want to talk to him. And this is where it gets a little interesting. Why would anybody utter a word? Just play Uncle Junior and just start muttering to yourself incoherently. Stanfa would actually go on to testify twice before a federal grand jury looking into the murder of Bruno. At the second federal grand jury of April 21st of 1980, he was asked two specific questions in which his answers were complete fucking lies. And this, I have the transcripts. This I was able to get. And does anybody else do transcripts? Nope. So he appears as a witness before the grand jury, and then and there being under oath did knowingly declare with respect to a material matter as follows. Question: have you ever traveled with Mr. Sindone or Mr. Simone to New York City? Answer: no. Whereas, in truth and fact, as John Stanfa then then knew, he had actually on March 27th, 1980, traveled to New York with Frank Sindone and John Simone. Okay, here comes the second one. Did you ever go out of town with Mr. Sindone? I don't remember. And as a result of those answers, the FBI had already known that John Stanfa had gone to Newark, New Jersey with Frank Sindone, and thereafter on the 27th of March of 1980, John Stanfa had gone to New York City with Frank Sindone. And then on March 28th of 1980, John Stanfa continued to be in New York City with Frank Sindone. And so as a result of that, they charged him with 2 counts of perjury. Stanfa gets a tip-off and he flees to Baltimore. And he gets help from the Gambino crime family to hide. 8 months later, he's arrested in Baltimore, brought back to Philadelphia, where a jury would find him guilty of perjury. Stanfa would be hammered by a judge, and Stanfa would be sentenced to 5 years on the first count of perjury and 3 on the second count of perjury. That's 8 fucking years, and it was going to be served consecutively. That's a ton of time for perjury, 8 fucking years. Stanfa would appeal that, and his appeal had some merit. However, there's something a little interesting in this appeal that is funny, yet very interesting as to why he would allow his lawyer to say this. Stanfa would argue to the district court that they abused his discretion in refusing to allow him to introduce evidence of the gangland style slangs of Simone, Sindone, and a third person, Antonio Caponegro, which evidence was offered to support Stanfa's contention that he testified under duress. The slangs of Sindone and Simone occurred months after Stanfa's grand jury testimony. So he tried to use 2 murders after the first testimony. You know, it's crazy. But it's crazy to me that he would even say that he was under duress because people got murdered. Well, if you're not in the mob and you're denying all of that, why even acknowledge these fucking people? It's just very odd to me. Although Caponegro was murdered 3 days before Stanfa's grand jury testimony, the body was not identified until days after Stanfa's testimony, which is why the district court would reject evidence of this particular argument in those 3 murders under the Federal Rule of Evidence 403, which allows exclusion of relevant evidence if its probative value is substantially outweighed by the danger of unfair prejudice. The district court held that the evidence of the slangs was of little, if any, relevance to Stanfa's state of mind at the time of his testimony because Stanfa had not yet learned of the slangs. The court also held that, assuming its relevance, the danger of unfair prejudice substantially outweighed its probative value. So, in any event, Stanfa's heading off to Club Fed for 8 years. In 1987, he's released from prison, and according to many, went back to Sicily for a little bit, then went back to New York for a while, and kept a very, very low profile. Many have said he wasn't doing really much at all. So he ends up venturing back into Philadelphia in 1989, 1990. The streets were pretty much a wreck at that point, and Anthony Piccolo had unofficially taken over as the street boss of Philadelphia, with Nicky trying to remain in charge of the family from Atlanta. with instability being a huge problem, and the New York Commission, fed up with Nicky's antics, sent him a message in October of 1990. And that message was, "You're no longer the boss of Philadelphia. Have a nice life." You imagine what he must have been like in that fucking cell? He probably went fucking crazy. But the chief concern was that, he would try to pull strings from prison and that the murders would continue. And that was the commission's big fear. The commission also worried about massive power vacuum situation in Philadelphia. And so, therefore, the Genovese crime family, the Gambino crime family, voted to install John Stanfa as the new boss. So what we need to ask is who was in control of those families at the time? Well, for the Gambinos, it would have been John Gotti's decision ultimately, but he was in prison at the time. So I'm sure word was sent from Gotti through his ruling panel at the time to back the decision. That ruling panel would have been John Jr., Jimmy Brown Fiala, John D'Amico, Louis Valario, or Peter Gotti, or depending on the time frame, John Gotti, Jimmy Brown Fiala, excuse me, John D'Amico, Joe Curry, Peter Gotti. Like I said, it just depends on the exact date. For the Genovese side of things, it would have been Vinny the Chin Gigante and nobody else. In either case, Stanfa is now the official boss, but wouldn't be recognized officially until 1991, until he took over the reins in October of 1990. Now, the problem on its face is that this is New York once again flexing its muscles in Philadelphia, and it's being seen on the streets to many as meddling in family affairs that they shouldn't be. And let's be honest, who New York has backed prior, other than let's say Angelo Bruno, has backfired on them completely in a wrong kind of way. And you'd think that they would just wipe their hands of them. But once again, New York meddles, and they expected a different outcome. And so I want to preface a few things just from a street level. Number one, when turmoil has been the consistency since Bruno got killed, I just truly do not fucking understand why New York believed for one fucking second that this would go in another position but tits up. But even in saying that, we have to look at John Stanfa, right? Regardless of what John Stanfa was or he wasn't, the reality is, as one of our people asked a question about him earlier, was, he was considered an interloper in many instances. They didn't consider him a part of the group. And as I said, we don't have a catalog of events with Stanfa, but in fact, we have to assume he got made at some point by Bruno, because he wasn't an inducted member in New York, because he's not like Ralph Natale. He wasn't made twice. Which raises a question as to why New York would plant a flag on Stanfa to begin with. And we can argue, who else would have taken over? And the list probably would be very short, but I think, the Gambinos and the Genoveses, Stanfa was a guy with old world views who came from Sicily and had connections with both families and probably closer resembled stock like Bruno than, say, Scarfo. But I think that they realized, I don't think that they realized that Stanfa was every bit of Scarfo amplified to some extent. And had they known that, I don't know who else offhand they could have backed or who would have been better. But I can tell you this, it was a mistake backing Stanfa because out of the gate, Stanfa's back is already against the wall. So I'm not even sure what Stanfa could have actually done in all reality. But back on the streets, like I said, it appeared that the Mafia back in New York was pretty much handpicking who would do what and when. And many felt that Stanfa, who was never a captain, never held any rank, all of a sudden is their boss. He's the boss of South Philadelphia when he's repeatedly ran and hid with the Gambinos. So from that angle, I completely understand how the streets would feel about that. This isn't some high-ranking guy moving up the ladder the old-fashioned way. It's not some guy who's put in a ton of work, working his way up the ladder, ascending the throne the traditional way. This is exactly why guys saw it as Gambino and Genovese encroachment more than anything. So back on the streets, as we always say, especially in the city of brotherly love, there has always been one side and then there's the other side. And it's still very much that way. It's always been split. Look at Harry Riccobene, then Caponegro, then Scarfo. Then after Scarfo, nobody wanted the headaches anymore. Under Stanfa, it would be no different. When Stanfa arrives on the scene, it was business as usual. Tax everybody, get guys in lines, and shake down whoever the fuck they could. Stanfa, in many ways, was the gutter version of Bruno. While Bruno used mediation as a tool backed by his power in New York, Stanfa was completely different. He was an old-world Sicilian with a violent streak, and wouldn't condone any missteps from his own guys. And while looking at it objectively, I know what he was trying to do. But as I've always said, he's an old world thinking guy. And most of the guys in South Philadelphia were 2, 3, and 4 generations already removed from Italy. So you have an upcoming younger group of new wave gangsters who are coming up. And I'm going to state this again, like I stated earlier. I may or may not be friends with some of these people. And I don't want to mention them by name. And you could look it up for yourself. And I'm not going to discuss all the murders, tit for tat, other than just by mentioning a couple of things. I will say this, in fairness, I know you guys are here to listen to a mob war. And I'm going to give it to you in a way that you might have, I'm going to give it to you in a certain kind of way, but you might have to go look up some stuff for yourself. And this upcoming group was led by Joey Merlino. Merlino at the time was in the can in 1990, and he meets Ralph Natale and McKean Correctional. What Joey wanted was to control the Philadelphia Mafia, and he saw an opening, and he and Natale, at least according to Natale, begin to scheme on how to absorb the Philadelphia Mafia. With Stanfa taking over, things got messy very quickly because Stanfa almost immediately becomes a brute. And I guess that news was filtering back to Joey in prison. I got to imagine it did. Stanfa, as I said, was extending street tax, and the Merlino group was doing their own thing too. They were collecting tax. They were doing the same exact thing. Stanfa would send Felix Puccino to collect on his behalf, and on January 29th of 92, Stanfa was sent a message when Felix Puccino would be gunned down. The Merlino faction wasn't paying a fucking cent to John Stanfa. Go fuck yourself. Boom, kill him. While Stanfa was irate, he tried to appease everybody. He actually attempts to kill Michael Cingolini, which didn't work out. And Merlino never forgot that. Stanfa ends up making Joe Cingolini his underboss. And it was meant as a way to appease everybody, right? So while Joey's still in prison, Stanfa brings 2 Sicilian hitmen, Biagio Ordinetto, and Rosario Bellocci. Merlino gets released in April of 92. Stanfa was already plotting the demise of Merlino, and in September of that year, he inducts Joey and Michael Cingolini and Biagio Adornetto into the organization. And it was a move that was widely raised eyebrows. Like, why are you inducting Joey Merlino and Michael into the mob? Like, are you crazy? But Stanfa's plan was to keep Merlino close because his intention all along was to kill him. Stanfa also offhand thought that maybe inducting Merlino would suffice things, but really his long-term plan was to draw Merlino in and cut off his fucking head when he wasn't looking. So while Stanfa was making plans on clipping Joey, Joey was 3 steps ahead of John Stanfa, as he has been with everybody. According to many, Joey was laying off bets and not paying anybody back, telling them to go fuck themselves. What else could they do about it? And it was beginning to agitate Stanfa because he couldn't understand why a guy who was made wasn't paying debts. And people started to complain to Stanfa. And many have used that as some sort of surreptitious thing to use against Joey Merlino. Oh, he doesn't pay, he's just a thief, fuck him, But I can tell you to some extent, that's part of it, but he's also playing his hand to Stanfa, agitating him, infuriating him, get him angry, get him off the focus. Because if you got somebody that's angry specifically at you, they're not paying attention to anything else, right? A lot of people underestimate the intelligence of Joe. I'm just telling you for 100%. So Merlino, albeit according to the federal government, would strike first. And the first ever recorded mob hit in history on camera, Stanfa's underboss is shot on March 2nd of 92. And he was shot in the head, neck, and chest. And we know that is Cingolini, right? Even though he survives the hit, he was done in the mob. And again, another message is sent to Stanfa. Go fuck yourself. You ain't shit. And at this point, Stanfa goes absolutely fucking ballistic. It also doesn't help that Natale is getting out. And he starts to hear, word starts to trickle back that Natale is using contacts back in New York City to try to back up his effort to kill John Stanfa and to wipe him off the fucking map, or at least he's being fed that information. So I don't know if Natale was actually really doing that, or whether people were just saying that, knowing it would filter back to Stanfa, making him even more irate. So there's a lot of wheels in play here. And as a result, John Stanfa immediately orders the death of Joey Merlino and Michael Cingolini. On August 5th of 1993, Joey Merlino and Michael Cingolini are standing on the corner of South Philadelphia when a car rides by and gunfire breaks out. Joey's shot 4 times in the legs and the ass, and Michael Cingolini dies right there on the pavement. Not 26 days later, God, this is my favorite part. 26 days later, John Stanfa is driving on the Schuylkill Expressway in Philadelphia in rush hour traffic with his son sitting next to him and a driver. A van would pull up with blacked out windows. A door slides open and a few men with automatic weapons light up the car. Stanfa's car gets riddled with bullet holes. His son would be shot in the face, but everybody else in the car is pretty much relatively unscathed. Stanfa's driver was actually driving on his fucking rims because the tires were blown out, and he actually managed to get Stanfa off the expressway. The hit was ballsy, it was brazen, but it would bring a ton of hit. Luckily, Stanfa's son would recover. Stanfa was seething and wanted the entire Merlino faction wiped off the fucking earth. Both sides would continue to take shots at one another. Within 2 years of taking over, Stanfa had ordered 10 murders. Any hope that a new boss would be anything different than Scarfo? Anybody that even thought that is out of their fucking minds. You know the funniest part about the hit on Stanfa is that when investigators found the fucking van, there were bullet holes inside the van. Like when the door shut, they kept firing. Oh, God. So I don't know specifically what New York thought about that. However, we can sort of gauge things because they could have gotten involved in a major way in Philadelphia. They could have supplied guys to go to war. And there's a lot they could have done, but they did nothing. They stood back, they wiped their hands of it, and they watched. And as Stanfa gets more and more angry, he ends up inducting men into the family who didn't have any acumen or business. John Vesey is one of those guys. He inducts a kid whose father wasn't even Italian. Stanfa's need for blood outweighed his need for peace. Stanfa would try a dozen times to blow up Joey Merlino in car bombs, and every time the car bomb didn't work. Never mind the gang that couldn't shoot straight. This is the gang that couldn't blow up straight. You got to cross the blue with the red, Frank. I told you last time. Red and blue, green and blue. No, the red and the blue, Frank, you dumb fuck. You need glasses. So in November of 1993, Joey Merlino gets arrested on a parole violation and gets sent back to prison. And it's probably what simmered everything down for the most part. But in March of 94, John Stanfa is indicted for murder, racketeering, extortion, and loan sharking and multi-conspiracy murder charges. Turns out John VC had flipped. It was about to bury John Stanfa. On the opening day of Stanfa's trial, this is some Machiavellian shit. On the opening day of Stanfa's trial on October 5th of 1995, Billy Vesey, John Vesey's brother, was shot and murdered in his car a couple of blocks away from the courthouse. Many believe that John Stanfa had ordered that to silence a rat, but the truth is he didn't. And it's long been said that the murder was, justified in making sure that Stanfa could never get acquitted of anything. Publicly, it looked like Stanfa whacked the brother of an informant to get him to not talk. But that was very far from the reality of what actually happened. Stanfa would be convicted on 33 of 35 counts. He would be sentenced to 5 life terms without parole. And that gave way to Ralph Natale and Joey Merlino to take over. According to gossip, Natale had never been a made guy ever. Never been made in any family, and that he actually paid to get made. Don't know if that's true or not. But Natale would become the epitome of a Dunsky in a short period of time, with Merlino playing the puppet. Let him put him out front, let him take the fucking heat. Because as we know, history always repeats itself. And yeah, we could have gotten into Ron Previty a little bit, but we're not. And the rest is history. And so what I want you to look at with this is sort of the mechanics. Did Stanfa deserve to be boss? No. That was the power of friendships. And the younger guys coming up who were hustling and breaking their balls and doing what they had to do And they weren't even made guys. They were just their own crew doing shit, shaking people down, extorting, bookmaking, loan sharking, etc. Here comes this fucking guy who hasn't been around. He's the boss now, and he's going to try to take our action? I think not. Which is why Felix Bocchino got killed. That's sending a fucking message. We're not afraid of you. You don't mean shit to us. And then all hell breaks loose. Now, if you're interested, you can head over to YouTube and type in Mafia hit in South Philadelphia. You can watch the hit. You're not going to see nobody get hurt. But you're going to see the first ever recorded American mob hit caught on fucking film. It's crazy. Brother against brother. It's crazy. I often wonder how Joe Sr. felt about that. You know, sadly, he passed away, I think, last year, or a couple of months back. Not that we've ever asked him that. But that's always been, and I say this from the very beginning, Philadelphia's always been like this. They're fighting over 12 blocks. And if you guys remember when we started with this first episode, what did we talk about the most? This is how it started. The Jews were fighting with the Irish were fighting with the Italians, and everybody was fighting over 12 square blocks. And yeah, Philadelphia has always been labeled as a dysfunctional crime family. But I want to mention this because, as we know, when Joey took over, there was a lot more murder. Okay, so it's not like it stopped, but it stopped within a couple of years' time. But since then, have there been murders there? What have the feds been able to acquire? Anthony Pergiano, fucking nobody. Bent finger, go fuck yourself, Lou Monticello. Couldn't give up anybody. Didn't work. And that's the thing. If you look at what we said, the Young Turk group came together. They've been together since they were babies. Not a single one of them has ever told on a soul or said anything. It's always an outside guy. And so the argument that one always makes is, well, you know, you look at a New York family, they got 200 guys, a ton of money coming in, but there's probably some guys that don't know each other that well. But for every positive attribute, there are some negative attributes as well. You know, which I'm not going to totally touch on because I think it's obvious. Do I think Philadelphia would be better served another way? Sure, absolutely. And that's not to denigrate anybody. But I'm basing a lot of that on history. But the thing about history, the beautiful thing about history is it always repeats itself. Always. Always has, and it always will. Not that I'm a gambling guy. Not that I'm the amazing Krushkin or whatever the fuck, Mr. Wizard, whoever the fuck they are. But I'm telling you, history is going to repeat itself again. And the reason why it will is because there are those that are capable. There are those that have old school values. And then there's guys that are just happy with the bottom line. Friendship is a very strange thing. You know, it is a very strange thing how the ebb and flow of friendships in the street work. I'm not telling you bad things are going to happen. I'm not even going to say that. But I think you're going to see a big change in the next decade in Philadelphia. 100%. You know, that's just coming from my own insight and seeing things. Things are going to change. But the question becomes, and I think Chris Gorky really brought up an interesting point. You know, who the fuck wants to be in organized crime these days? Look at all the bullshit. You're not making no fucking money. I agree with you. I agree with that stance. But as long as there's shit to take without paying for it, guys are going to do it. That's just the reality of that. And yes, I know this part of the Philly mob war was like not the biggest thing in the world, the ending, because I took a lot of stuff out. And I think a lot of you know why. I don't care who shot who did. To me, it doesn't matter who did what. It's the evolution of street politics here. This is street politics. John Stanfa, who was put in as boss, who didn't really deserve it, didn't really earn it. When he needed help the most, he was so blind by his fucking rage, he made mistakes. This guy didn't last long at all. Then the next group that came along has been there for 30 years. Somebody's got to be doing something right. All right, so that's going to be it for this week. We are going to be back next week with an all-new episode. Don't forget, Sunday night, 8:35 on YouTube, Mob Talk Radio Live. Monday night, 8:45, Tales of the Night Horror Podcast. Are exorcisms real? Have a great weekend, everybody, and we will see